The air on the LeBlanc plantation was thick enough to choke on, heavy with the sweet rot of sugarcane and the bitter tang of despair. For Phoebe Allen, it was a cage, and she was about to break the lock one moonless night. During the frenzy of the harvest, she simply vanished. The only thing they found was her shawl, snagged on a cane stalk, its edge strangely scorched as if licked by a phantom flame. Then the light started. Unholy lights, flickering high above the cane, where no lantern could hang, and no star should be. They said it was a ghost, a demon, but a few dared to whisper the truth, that Phoebe was still out there, a spirit of defiance carving her own path out of the darkness. They didn't know her disappearance was not an escape, but the beginning of a war. They didn't know the scorched shawl was a declaration, and they certainly didn't know that the strange lights in the cane were not a ghost story, but a map. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The Louisiana sun of 1839 was a merciless tyrant, beating down upon the sprawling sugarcane fields of Belle Reve plantation with a physical weight. It baked the earth until it cracked and bleached the sky to a hazy, indifferent white. The air was a suffocating blanket of humidity, so thick it felt like breathing in warm water, each gasp tasting of cloying sweetness from the cut cane and the metallic tang of human sweat. A constant, droning buzz of insects formed a maddening symphony, a soundtrack to the rhythmic, brutal thwack of machetes hacking through the thick stalks. This was the sound of the harvest, the sound of wealth being carved from the flesh of the land and the bones of its people. Perched on his chestnut mare, the overseer, Mr. Dubois, was a figure of pure menace, a vulture surveying his kingdom of misery. His shadow slid over the bent backs of the workers, the coiled whip on his saddle a constant silent promise of pain. He patrolled the rows with a proprietary air, his gaze lingering, assessing, and consuming. Among the workers, Phoebe Allen moved with a focused, almost unnerving intensity. She was in her mid-20s, with a strength in her slender frame that was born of relentless labor. Her movements were a study in efficiency, each swing of her machete precise and powerful, severing the cane stalks with a clean, angry chop. But her eyes, dark and intelligent, were never still. They were constantly scanning, observing everything, not with the downcast fear that marked so many, but with a chilling calculation. She noted the way the cane grew thickest near the western edge, creating a wall of vegetation. She noted the slight dip in the land that collected water after a rain. She noted the patterns of the patrols, the habits of the men who enforced her bondage. Jeremiah, a field hand whose broad shoulders and quiet strength were a comfort in this hellscape, worked a few paces away. He had loved Phoebe in secret for years, a love expressed in fleeting glances and coded whispers, a shared language of survival. He saw the change in her, a new stillness, a dangerous edge to her calm. He saw her watching Dubois, and his heart clenched with a familiar, helpless dread. The overseer's horse stopped, its hot breath misting in the humid air. Dubois leaned on his saddle horn, his eyes crawling over Phoebe's form. "You work hard, Phoebe," he said, his voice a greasy caress that made her skin crawl. "A woman like you should be rewarded. In the big house, perhaps." His offer hung in the air, thick and poisonous, an invitation to a different kind of violation. Phoebe did not look up. Her machete never stopped its rhythm. Thwack, thwack, thwack. A heartbeat of defiance against the oppressive silence. "The only reward I need is the end of the day, sir," she replied, her voice clear and steady, carrying just enough to be heard without being insolent. Dubois' lips tightened into a sneer. He grunted, a sound of thwarted power, and spurred his horse onward, his passing stirring a cloud of dust and resentment. Later, as they paused to gulp water from a shared gourd, Jeremiah moved closer, his voice a low rumble of concern. "You play a dangerous game with him," he whispered, his eyes full of worry. Phoebe finally looked at him, her gaze direct and unblinking. A flicker of something that was not fear, but fire, danced in their depths. "The whole world is a dangerous game, Jeremiah," she said, her voice just as low but laced with steel. "The trick is to choose your own rules." As dusk bled purple and orange across the sky, the bone-weary workers trudged back to the quarters. The small, cramped cabins, huddled together as if for protection, offered a sanctuary of sorts. The air here was different, filled with the smells of wood smoke, boiling greens, and the low murmur of tired voices sharing the day's burdens. It was a place where they were not merely property, but people, for a few precious hours. Inside their cabin, firelight danced on the rough-hewn walls, casting long, flickering shadows. Phoebe knelt by her mother, Mama Elara, and gently spooned the most tender portion of her own meager meal of corn mush and greens into the old woman's bowl. Mama Elara was frail, her body stooped by years of hardship, but her eyes held a deep well of wisdom. She was a keeper of old stories, a connoisseur of herbs and roots, a woman who could read the secrets whispered by the wind and the rustling leaves. She took Phoebe's hand, her thumb, dry and papery as a leaf, tracing slow, deliberate patterns on her daughter's skin. "The cane holds its breath tonight," she said, her voice a cryptic, reedy whisper. "Something is about to break." Phoebe met her mother's gaze and saw not a question, but a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of a decision already made. Later, in the deep shadows that pooled between the cabins, a space for secrets and stolen moments, she met Jeremiah. He pressed a small, crudely carved wooden bird into her palm. It was warm from his hand, its lines smoothed by his patient whittling. It was a secret gift, a tangible piece of his heart. "Be careful, Phoebe," he pleaded, his voice thick with an emotion he could not fully express. "Don't let your anger make you reckless. He's watching you." Phoebe's fingers closed around the bird, its delicate form a stark contrast to the calloused resolve in her soul. "Careful is for sheep, Jeremiah," she said softly, her eyes turning from his worried face to the vast, impenetrable darkness of the fields that stretched out beyond the firelight. "I am not a sheep." She stared into the blackness, a sea of rustling cane that had imprisoned her for her entire life. But she did not see walls. She saw something else entirely. "They think these fields are their prison," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "But a big enough prison can be a wilderness, a place to get lost." Jeremiah saw the finality in her eyes and knew, with a sinking heart, that she was already gone. The moon was a mere sliver, a scratch of silver against a black velvet sky, offering no comfort and no light. The night was absolute, a darkness that swallowed sound and sight. The usual chorus of crickets and frogs was muted, replaced by the incessant, whispering rustle of the sugarcane, a sound like 1,000 hushed conversations. It was the hour when the world held its breath, the deepest point of the night before the false dawn. Under the pretext of fetching water from the well, Phoebe slipped away from the quarters. She moved with a preternatural silence, her bare feet making no sound on the packed earth. She was a shadow among shadows, her every movement filled with a chilling purpose that had been honed over weeks of planning. She reached the edge of the field, a solid wall of cane rising 15 feet into the air. A living fortress. She paused, taking a single deep breath, the sweet, cloying scent of the cane filling her lungs one last time. It was the smell of her prison, and soon it would be the smell of her liberation. With a steady hand, she reached up and deliberately snagged her shawl, a simple length of faded blue cotton her mother had woven for her. On the sharp, spear-like tip of a broken cane stalk, it fluttered there, a flag of surrender she had no intention of honoring. From a small pouch tied at her waist, she produced a tiny vial filled with a clear, viscous liquid, a concoction Mama Ilara had prepared from phosphorescent fungi and rendered fish oil. She uncorked it and carefully dabbed a small amount onto the trailing edge of the shawl. Then, she took out a small piece of flint and steel. Shielding the motion with her body, she struck a spark. It was not a large flame, just a tiny, hungry ember that caught on the treated fabric. It didn't burst into a fire, but sizzled and smoldered, scorching a strange, deliberate symbol into the cloth, a spiral with a single, straight line cutting through its center. It was not the mark of an accident, but a message, a sigil burned into the fabric of her old life, a declaration. She watched the ember die, leaving the symbol glowing faintly for a moment before fading to a dark, permanent scar. She gave the shawl one last look, a final farewell to the woman she had been. Then, without a shred of hesitation, she turned and melted into the dense, whispering wall of sugarcane, swallowed by the wilderness she intended to make her own. The rustling cane closed behind her, leaving only a profound silence and a single scorched clue hanging in the starless night. The dawn broke not with a gentle blush, but with a raw, angry gash of red across the eastern horizon. The oppressive humidity of the night had not lifted, and a tense, unnatural quiet hung over Belle Reve. It was a silence that was quickly shattered. The deep, guttural bellow of the alarm horn ripped through the air, a sound designed to instill immediate fear. It was the sound of a breach, a violation of the absolute order that governed their lives. Doors to the slave quarters were thrown open, not by their inhabitants, but by the heavy boots of the junior overseers. Out! Everybody out! The shouts were sharp, laced with a frantic energy that sent a ripple of panic through the waking community. They were herded into the open space between the cabins, their faces a mixture of groggy confusion, stark terror, and a deeply buried secret curiosity. They knew what the horn meant. Someone was gone. Mr. Dubois stood in the center of the commotion, his face a mask of thunderous fury. His authority had been challenged, his perfect record of control shattered. He paced like a caged animal, his riding crop smacking against his leather leggings, each crack a punctuation mark to his rage. His eyes, bloodshot and wild, scanned the faces before him, searching for a flicker of guilt, a hint of complicity. "Where is she?" he roared, his voice cracking like a whip. "The Allen woman. Who helped her?" He grabbed a man by the front of his shirt, his knuckles white. "Did you see anything?" The man, trembling, could only shake his head. Dubois shoved him away in disgust. He interrogated everyone, his questions a barrage of accusations. Jeremiah stood amongst the crowd, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He kept his face a blank canvas, his eyes downcast, projecting the same fear as everyone else, while a storm of hope and terror raged within him. He could feel Dubois' gaze sweep over him, lingering for a beat too long, and he forced himself not to flinch. The initial, chaotic search of the quarters yielded nothing. It was then that a small party of men was dispatched to the fields, to the well, to the last place she was seen. It didn't take long. A shout went up from the edge of the western cane field. Dubois galloped over, leaping from his horse before it had fully stopped. One of his men pointed. There, snagged on a broken stalk, was Phoebe's shawl. It fluttered gently in the morning breeze, a fragile blue ghost against the towering green cane. Dubois snatched it down. "An accident," one of his men grunted, gesturing to the sharp stalk. "Must have caught it and run off in a panic." But Dubois wasn't so sure. He ran his thumb over the fabric, feeling the familiar rough cotton. Then his fingers found the mark. It was a scorch, a dark, ugly scar on the faded blue. He brought it closer, his eyes narrowing. It wasn't a random burn. The edges were too clean, the shape too deliberate. A spiral, with a line through it. It was a brand, a symbol. He held it up, the morning light shining through the fabric, illuminating the strange mark for all to see. "This is not panic," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "This is defiance." Just then, Master LeBlanc arrived, riding a fine white stallion that picked its way delicately through the dirt. He was a man whose cruelty was not born of passion, but of cold, hard arithmetic. He looked at the assembled slaves, at the furious face of his overseer, and at the shawl in Dubois' hand with an air of profound annoyance. Phoebe was a piece of property, a valuable asset, and her absence was an entry on the wrong side of his ledger. "Find her, Dubois," LeBlanc said, his voice clipped and devoid of emotion. He did not care for symbols or defiance. An example must be made, a swift and public one. This is a matter of profit, not your pride. He turned his horse and rode away without another word, leaving Dubois standing there, the scorched shawl clutched in his fist, his personal obsession now sanctioned by the cold calculus of his master. Fear, thick and suffocating, gripped the quarters. But beneath it, in the secret corners of their hearts, a tiny, dangerous spark of hope had been lit. The hunt began in earnest. It was a brutal, ugly affair, a wave of violence crashing against the landscape. The baying of the hounds was a terrifying sound, a promise of torn flesh and agony that echoed through the fields. Men on horseback charged through the dense cane, their passage a destructive force, trampling the valuable crop in their single-minded pursuit. The natural beauty of the Louisiana countryside, with its lush greens and vibrant life, became the backdrop for a scene of profound ugliness. The search was a violation, an assertion of power that aimed to crush not just the body of the runaway, but the very idea of freedom. Dubois drove the search party with a relentless, feverish energy. He was convinced Phoebe was close, hiding, listening to the sounds of her impending capture. He imagined her terror, and the thought fueled his determination. Jeremiah was forced to join the party, his knowledge of the plantation's terrain making him a valuable, if unwilling, tracker. He walked with the hounds, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Every step was a tightrope walk between self-preservation and his desperate need to protect Phoebe. In his pocket, his fingers nervously traced the outline of a small, greasy pouch. It was something Phoebe had given him weeks ago, a just-in-case, filled with a pungent mixture of herbs and animal musk. "It will confuse a dog's nose," she had explained, her voice calm and practical. "Make them think a fox or a boar went by." Now, walking ahead of the main party, pretending to clear a path, he would subtly shake a few grains of the mixture onto the ground when no one was looking, creating a confusing cross-scent. The hounds, catching the alien smell, would whine and veer off, their expert noses momentarily baffled. Dubois grew increasingly frustrated. The dogs kept leading them on false trails, circling back on themselves, or heading towards the impassable, snake-infested heart of the bayou. "She's playing with us," he snarled, his face slick with sweat. He turned his suspicious gaze on Jeremiah. "You were close to her. You know her mind. Where would she go?" Jeremiah met his gaze, his own face a carefully constructed mask of earnest concentration. He thought of the cypress tree at the edge of the swamp, the place she had shown him, the place that marked a hidden, safer path. He had to send them in the opposite direction. "She was afraid of the swamp, sir," Jeremiah said, his voice smooth and steady, a perfect imitation of a helpful servant. "Said it was full of spirits and quicksand." "Or maybe try to follow the river north, where the land is drier." It was a calculated lie, a dangerous gamble, but it was all he had. He pointed towards a place where he had found a freshly broken branch, another piece of misdirection. Dubois stared at him for a long moment, his eyes searching for any sign of deceit. Finally, he grunted and spurred his horse in the direction Jeremiah had indicated, the hounds and the rest of the party following him. Jeremiah let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding, the tension in his shoulders easing just a fraction. He was rooting for a ghost, walking a razor's edge, but for now, he was still walking. Several nights passed. The brutal search had turned up nothing, and a heavy, watchful silence fell over Belle Reve. The harvest continued, but the energy was gone, replaced by a sullen, resentful obedience. Everyone was on edge. The memory of the hunt, and the reality of Phoebe's empty space in the world, a constant, unspoken presence. In the evenings, the people gathered in the quarters, their conversations hushed, their eyes constantly straying towards the dark, menacing wall of the cane fields. They were waiting, though none of them knew for what. Old man Cato, an elder whose face was a roadmap of sorrows and whose voice held the gravelly wisdom of generations, sat by a small fire, telling stories to a group of wide-eyed children. He spoke of Anansi the spider, of clever rabbits and foolish lions, tales of the weak outsmarting the strong. It was a young girl, no older than 7, who saw it first. Her story was interrupted by a small gasp. She pointed a trembling finger towards the distant fields. "Look," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. Everyone turned. At first, they saw nothing but the familiar, impenetrable blackness. Then it appeared, a single steady light flickered into existence. It was high off the ground, far too high for a person to be holding a lantern, and it glowed with a soft greenish-white luminescence, like a captured star. It wasn't the frantic, darting light of a will-o'-the-wisp, but a calm, unwavering beacon. It held there for a full minute, a silent, luminous eye in the darkness, and then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. A collective gasp went through the small crowd. Before they could question what they had seen, another light appeared, this one further to the west, deeper in the cane. Whispers erupted, a mixture of fear and wonder. "What is that?" a woman breathed. "A spirit," another asked, pulling her children closer. "Swamp gas," a man muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. The lights were too high, too steady. It was then that old man Cato, who had been watching with an unreadable expression, gave the legend its first breath. He leaned forward, the firelight catching the silver in his hair and the profound depth in his eyes. His voice was a low, powerful rumble that cut through the fearful whispers. "That ain't no swamp gas," he said, his words carrying the weight of prophecy. "And that ain't no lost spirit." He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting every eye fix upon him. "That's her," he declared, his voice ringing with a newfound strength. "That's Phoebe. She's lighting her own way. She's walking the night road to freedom, and she's leaving a trail for those with the courage to see." In that moment, the fear did not vanish, but it was joined by something new, something powerful and bright. The runaway field hand was gone. In her place, a spirit of defiance had been born. A ghost who haunted not with terror, but with the impossible, incandescent promise of hope. The legend of Phoebe's ghost took root in the fertile soil of fear and hope, and its tendrils began to wrap themselves around the very structure of Belle Reve. The overseer's office, a small, stuffy room in the main house, became the epicenter of one man's spiraling obsession. Maps of the plantation, once pristine documents of ownership and control, were now desecrated with frantic charcoal circles and lines, marking the locations of the nightly apparitions. The air within was stale, thick with the scent of cheap whiskey and unwashed linen. Mr. Dubois was becoming a creature of the night, his face pale and drawn, his eyes holding a wild, feverish glint that spoke of sleepless vigils and mounting paranoia. His uniform was stained, his hair unkempt, his entire being consumed by the phantom in the cane. He stood before Master LeBlanc, his hands trembling slightly as he gestured towards the defaced map. "It's not just one runaway, sir," Dubois insisted, his voice raspy and urgent. "It's a symbol. It's poison seeping into the minds of the others. They don't fear the whip anymore, they whisper about her. They're calling her a spirit, a ghost who walks the night. We need a permanent patrol, a line of men with guns to surround the fields after dark. We need to show them this ghost can be caught and bled like any other." LeBlanc sat behind his polished mahogany desk, steepling his fingers. He regarded his overseer not with concern, but with the cool, appraising eye of a man calculating a failing investment. "I am not paying a dozen men to sit in the dark and chase ghost stories, Dubois," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Your job is to bring in the harvest, a harvest which, I might add, is already behind schedule. Every stalk that rots in the field because your men are spooked by swamp gas is money out of my pocket. Get the cane cut. That is all that matters. Your obsession is becoming a liability. From the adjoining parlor, where she was ostensibly arranging a vase of wilting magnolias, Madame Genevieve Leblanc stood perfectly still, listening. Her life was a gilded cage, a monotonous cycle of needlepoint, vapid social calls, and the stifling attentions of a husband who treated her like another one of his prized possessions. The story of the runaway and the strange lights was the most thrilling, most vital thing to have happened on Belle Reve in years. It was a narrative of defiance in a world that demanded absolute submission. As she heard the raw, desperate edge in Dubois' voice and the cold, dismissive pragmatism in her husband's, she felt an unexpected and dangerous flicker of sympathy, not for the unraveling overseer, but for the woman who had caused it all. The ghost in the cane felt more real to her than anyone in this house. Leblanc waved a dismissive hand. Get out, Dubois, and get my harvest back on schedule. The overseer stood frozen for a moment, his jaw working silently, a portrait of impotent rage. He turned and stalked from the room, leaving behind the faint smell of madness and the cold, unyielding silence of his master's disapproval. Out in the fields, the work continued, but the rhythm had changed. The relentless driving pace that Dubois had once enforced had slackened, replaced by a new, subtle cadence of quiet rebellion. The legend of Phoebe's light was no longer just a story told in the dark. It had become a shield and a weapon. The air of sullen obedience was now tinged with a shared secret, a collective confidence that hummed just beneath the surface. The slowdowns were subtle, deniable, a series of unfortunate accidents that happened with increasing frequency. A man's grip would slip on his machete, the blade flying harmlessly into the dirt, the handle splitting against a rock, requiring a long walk back to the smithy for a repair. A heavy cart, laden with cut cane, would get stuck in a patch of soft mud that had never been a problem before, its wheels sinking to the axles, demanding the strength of 6 men, and an hour of wasted time to free it. When confronted, the workers would put on a masterful performance of fear, their eyes wide, their voices trembling. "It's the spook, sir," one would say to a junior overseer, his gaze darting towards the cane. "Hard to keep your mind on your work, knowing she's out there, watching." They blamed their clumsiness on being unnerved by the lights, on the chill that Phoebe's ghost had left on the air. It was an excuse that was impossible to disprove, and it slowly, steadily, eroded the plantation's efficiency. Jeremiah moved through this quiet insurrection like a phantom himself. He had become a subtle conductor, orchestrating the slowdowns with a nod here, a whispered word there. He saw Dubois, haggard and bleary-eyed from another sleepless night, stumble in the heat. "The master of the hunt looks tired," Jeremiah murmured to the man beside him, his voice barely audible over the rustling cane. "A tired hunter misses his prey. Take your time. Let the sun do its work on him." In the evenings, the legend grew. Old Man Cato, no longer just a storyteller but now the high priest of a new faith, held court by the fire. He embellished the tale with each telling, his voice a mesmerizing cadence of awe and reverence. Phoebe was no longer just a woman. She was an elemental spirit. He described her with wings woven from cane leaves and moonlight, allowing her to float above the stalks. Her eyes, he said, glowed like the embers of a dying fire, able to see into the hearts of wicked men. He told the children that the scorched symbol on her shawl was a pact she made with the night itself, a promise that she would forever be its guardian. The stories were for the children, to give them a hero in a world with none. But the adults listened with a fierce, hungry attention. They were drawing strength from the myth, forging a new sense of community in the heat of its telling. The legend of Phoebe was no longer about one woman's escape. It was about their collective soul, a shared belief that even in the deepest darkness, a light of defiance could not be extinguished. Jeremiah felt the pull every night, a magnetic north in his soul that drew his thoughts toward the swamp. He was inspired, emboldened by the chaos Phoebe had sown, but he felt adrift. The idea of escape, once a distant, impossible dream, was now a tangible thing, a seed planted in his heart. But a seed needed a path to sunlight, and he had none. He felt lost, a ship without a rudder, and he yearned for a sign, for the kind of clarity that had so obviously guided Phoebe's every move. One evening, driven by an instinct he couldn't name, he slipped away from the quarters and made his way to the remote edge of the plantation, where the cultivated fields gave way to the wild, tangled morass of the bayou. There stood a giant, ancient cypress, its gnarled branches draped in Spanish moss, its massive trunk a silent witness to centuries of secrets. It was their place, his and Phoebe's, a hidden cathedral where they had shared whispers, dreams, and the simple comfort of not being alone. He stood before the great tree, the sounds of the swamp a chorus of clicks, croaks, and unseen rustlings around him. He was thinking of her impossible courage, and a wave of despair washed over him. How could he ever hope to follow such a path? He leaned his forehead against the rough bark, a silent plea to a ghost. He ran his hand absently over the familiar, furrowed surface, a gesture of memory and loss. But his fingers snagged on something that did not belong. It was a line, sharp and unnatural, carved into the wood. His heart stopped. He pulled his hand back and stared. There, etched into the bark with a fresh, pale cut, was the symbol, the spiral with a single, straight line cutting through its center, the same mark that had been scorched onto her shawl. It was real. It was here. A jolt, potent as a lightning strike, shot through him. His breath hitched. He touched the carving again, tracing its impossible shape, the raw wood a testament to its recent creation. It was a message. His eyes scanned the trunk frantically, and then he saw them. Below the larger symbol was a series of smaller, cruder marks. They were lines and arrows, a primitive map that followed the twisting, branching patterns of the local waterways, heading consistently, defiantly, north. He stared at the marks, his mind struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what he was seeing. This was not the work of a spirit. This was the work of a planner, an organizer, a general. The lights in the cane, the scorched shawl, this carving, it was all part of a plan so audacious, so brilliant, that it defied belief. She was not a ghost haunting her past. She was a pioneer charting a future, a surge of pure, unadulterated hope, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees, flooded every corner of his being. His love and admiration for her, already a vast and boundless thing, deepened into a profound, reverent awe. He looked from the map carved in the tree to the dark, waiting swamp, and a slow, determined smile spread across his face. He whispered it to the ancient cypress, to the listening night, to her. "You didn't just leave," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "You left a door open. The haunting of Belle Reve was over. The revolution had just begun, against the explicit orders of his master. His pride wounded more deeply than his purse. Dubois began to spend his own money. The small cache of silver dollars he had saved for a plot of land of his own was now repurposed, fed into the furnace of his obsession. He rode to the nearest river town, a squalid collection of taverns and cheap boarding houses, and returned with 3 men whose loyalty could be bought for a few coins and a bottle. They were not trackers or woodsmen. They were disreputable souls with shifty eyes and the sour smell of desperation clinging to them, men who would do anything for a price. This was the army Dubois assembled to fight a ghost. Night after night, this grim and clumsy assembly would venture into the cane fields. The vigil always began with a swaggering bravado, the hired men passing a bottle of cheap whiskey back and forth, their laughter loud and coarse in the oppressive silence of the plantation after dark. But as the hours wore on and the darkness deepened, their courage, fueled by liquor, would begin to curdle. The constant whispering rustle of the cane, a simple sound of nature by day, transformed into the hushed conversations of 1,000 unseen spirits. They grew jumpy, starting at the snap of a twig or the mournful hoot of a distant owl, their drunken fingers twitching on the triggers of their heavy muskets. And then the lights would appear. They were never predictable. One would bloom like a phosphorescent flower high on a distant stalk, a calm, greenish-white beacon. As Dubois and his clumsy posse crashed through the dense cane towards it, their curses and heavy footfalls a sacrilege in the quiet, it would simply wink out. A moment later, it would reappear 100 yards behind them, silent and mocking. The lights seemed to possess a playful, malevolent intelligence, toying with them, leading them on a merry, maddening chase through the labyrinthine fields. They were lured into sucking patches of black mud that stole their boots and sent them sprawling through thickets of sawbriars that tore at their clothes and skin like angry claws, and directly into the paths of startled cottonmouths that sent them scrambling back with panicked yelps of terror. The chase was always, inevitably, fruitless. The lights were always just out of reach, ethereal and untouchable. One of the hired men, a burly fellow with a face like a spoiled potato, finally reached his limit. He threw his hat on the ground in a gesture of profound disgust, wiping a smear of mud from his cheek. "This is a fool's errand, Dubois," he spat, his voice thick with frustration. "We're chasing the moon's reflection in a puddle. There's nothing out here but bugs and bad liquor. No ghost is worth this." Dubois, his face a pale, sweating mask in the sickly glow of a lantern, turned on him. His eyes, bloodshot and wide, burned with a maniacal fire. "It's her!" he shrieked, his voice a raw, ragged thing that was barely human. "I can feel it. She's out there, laughing at us. She thinks she's clever, but I'll catch her. I'll drag her back by the hair and show everyone what happens to defiant ghosts." His obsession had consumed him entirely. He no longer slept, and his days were a walking nightmare of exhaustion and simmering rage. His supervision of the harvest, once meticulous in its cruelty, became sloppy and ineffective. He missed quotas, mismanaged assignments, and his temper, always volatile, now flared at the slightest provocation, leading to costly mistakes that did not go unnoticed by Master Leblanc. Dubois was no longer just a villain in the story of Belle Rêve. He was becoming a pathetic figure, a man so consumed by his own hatred that he was methodically destroying himself, unraveling thread by thread under the silent, watchful gaze of Phoebe's phantom lights. A week into Dubois's nightly follies, a section of the ornate iron fence bordering the main house's gardens rusted through, and Jeremiah was temporarily reassigned from the fields. His brute strength was needed to help the blacksmith wrestle the heavy, decorative panels back into place. The gardens were another world, a beautiful, manicured space of fragrant roses, sculpted hedges, and shaded pathways of crushed shells. It was a place of profound and deliberate peace, a stark, insulting contrast to the brutal, chaotic world of the cane fields that lay just beyond its walls. As Jeremiah worked under the hot sun, the sweat stinging his eyes, he was aware of being watched. Madame Genevieve was drifting through her garden, a book held loosely in one hand, her pale silk dress whispering over the manicured grass. She paused near a stone bench, partially obscured by a cascade of white jasmine, and pretended to read, though her eyes were not on the page. Jeremiah kept his head down, focusing on his work. The presence of the master's wife, a knot of tension in his gut. In this world, and any attention from the great house was dangerous. He heard the faint rustle of her dress as she rose and walked away, disappearing back into the grand prison of the main house without a word. A few minutes later, his task complete, he went to gather his tools. Near the bench where she had been sitting, tucked discreetly behind a stone leg, was a small package wrapped in plain brown cloth. His first instinct was to ignore it, to walk away and pretend he hadn't seen it. Anything out of place, anything unexpected, was a potential trap. But something made him pause. He glanced around. The garden was empty, silent save for the buzzing of bees in the jasmine. He quickly knelt, his heart hammering against his ribs, and picked up the bundle. It was heavier than it looked. He slipped it into the waistband of his rough trousers, his mind racing with a mixture of fear and wild speculation. Later, in the relative privacy of the sweltering blacksmith's shed, he unwrapped it. Inside, his breath caught in his throat. There was a thick wedge of cured ham, a small loaf of white bread, and a pair of worn but sturdy leather boots, the soles thick and barely used. It was a feast. It was a fortune. It was a kit for a journey. Jeremiah was stunned into silence, staring at the impossible gift. He didn't know why she would do this. This pale, silent woman who lived a life so removed from his own. It might as well have been on the moon. He could not guess at her motives. A complex and hidden tapestry of boredom with her gilded life, a flicker of latent guilt for the world her husband ruled, and a deep romantic fascination with the rebellion Phoebe represented. He only knew that this unexpected kindness was a lifeline. The next day, while sweeping the veranda, he saw a piece of paper lying near a pile of discarded leaves, as if blown there by the wind. It was an old, creased map of the parish, showing the intricate network of rivers, bayous, and settlements in astonishing detail. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it was not the wind that had placed it there. Madame Genevieve had become a silent, unknowable conspirator in his freedom. The nights became Jeremiah's secret kingdom, While the rest of the quarters slept the deep, dreamless sleep of the exhausted, he worked, in his small corner of the cabin, by the faint flickering light of a single stolen tallow candle. He laid his two maps side by side on the dirt floor. One was the elegant, precise drawing of the parish surveyor, a document of lines and names, of property and dominion. The other was the rough, desperate carving on the cypress tree, a map of pure survival, etched from memory and hope. He spent hours comparing them, his calloused finger tracing the winding blue lines of the rivers on the paper and matching them to the gouged marks Phoebe had left in the bark. He was learning the land not as a slave, but as an explorer, memorizing the shape of the waterways, the locations of the cypress stands, the hidden paths that led consistently, defiantly, north. He gathered what little he could, hoarding his resources like a miser. The boots from Madame Genevieve were hidden beneath a loose floorboard. He saved slivers of dried meat from his meager rations, wrapping them in scraps of cloth. He was building his arsenal for the coming war of escape. Finally, when he had learned all he could from the maps, and his small store of supplies was ready, he went to see Mama Ilara. He found her sitting outside her cabin in the deep twilight, her back straight, her eyes looking into the darkness as if she were expecting him. He did not say he was leaving. He did not have to. The knowledge passed between them in the quiet space of the night, an understanding deeper and more certain than words. She simply nodded, a slow, solemn gesture of acceptance and blessing. She beckoned him closer and pressed a small, tightly stitched leather pouch into his hand. It was cool and smooth against his skin. "Phoebe learned the old ways from me," she said, her voice a dry whisper, like leaves skittering across hard ground. "The ways of the earth, the secrets of the water, and the root. This," she said, tapping the pouch, "holds powdered willow bark and charcoal. It will keep the fever from the swamp water and settle your gut when there is nothing else." She then opened her other palm to reveal a small, gnarled sprig of a dark, pungent herb. The scent was sharp and wild, the smell of deep woods and damp earth, a perfume of freedom. "And this," she continued, her voice dropping even lower, "this is for the hounds. Rub it on the soles of those new boots. It will cover your scent with the smell of the fox. They will run in circles, their noses full of lies." She closed his fingers over the herb. Her hand was frail, but her grip was surprisingly strong, a final transference of strength and wisdom. "Go with the spirits of your ancestors, son," she commanded softly. "Follow her light. Don't you look back." He knelt before her for a moment, a silent gesture of gratitude and farewell that was heavier than any words. He returned to his cabin, his heart both heavy with the leaving and soaring with the possibility of what lay ahead. He made his final preparation, checking the sky each night, watching the clouds gather on the western horizon. He would not run on a clear night under a watchful moon. He would wait for the heavens themselves to provide him cover. He chose the night of a coming storm, a night when the wind would howl and the rain would fall in blinding sheets, a night when the world would be washed clean, and with it, every track he left behind. The tension in his chest was a palpable thing, a knot of fear and exhilarating hope. His escape was no longer a dream. It was a plan, and it was imminent. The storm did not arrive with subtlety. It declared war on the night. The wind came first, a low, mournful moan that grew into a physical force. a howling gale that rattled the flimsy doors of the cabins and tore at the thatched roofs. It was the sound of a world coming undone. Then came the rain, not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets that lashed the earth, turning the packed dirt of the quarters into a slick, running river of mud. For the men and women huddled inside, it was a night of misery, another hardship to be endured. For Jeremiah, it was a gift from a wrathful God, the perfect, chaotic cover for a sin of his own. He stood in the darkness of his cabin, the sounds of the storm a symphony of liberation. His heart pounded a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a drumbeat of fear and wild, soaring hope. He took one last look at the cramped space that had been his entire world, at the sleeping forms of the men with whom he had shared so much misery, and felt a pang of guilt, sharp and quick, for leaving them behind. But Phoebe's light called to him, a promise that transcended loyalty to a shared cage. He moved with the silence he had practiced for a lifetime, a ghost in his own home. He slipped out of the cabin, the wind immediately snatching at his clothes, and the cold rain plastering his shirt to his skin. He was soaked in an instant, but the water felt like a baptism, washing away the grime and sweat of Belle Reve, washing away the man he had been. He knelt in the mud, his hands working quickly, rubbing the pungent, wild-smelling herb from Mama Ilara onto the soles of his new boots. The sharp, foxy scent rose up, a wild perfume that was the antithesis of the cloying sweetness of the cane. He moved away from the quarters, a shadow swallowed by a greater darkness, his every step a prayer. The storm was his accomplice, its roar swallowing the sound of his passage, its deluge erasing his tracks the moment they were made. The hounds, even if they were roused, would find nothing but a confusing tapestry of scents. The trail of a man masked by the scent of a fox and washed away by the sky itself. He reached the ancient cypress tree at the edge of the swamp, its massive form a deeper black against the churning gray of the sky. He placed a hand on its wet, rough bark, on the spot where Phoebe had carved her message. This was the threshold. Behind him lay the ordered, brutal world of the plantation. Before him lay the bayou, a chaotic, deadly wilderness that now represented the only path to life. With a final deep breath that tasted of rain and wet earth, Jeremiah plunged into the swamp, leaving the world of men behind. The journey was a descent into another reality. The bayou was a living, breathing entity, and it was utterly indifferent to his survival. The ground beneath his feet was a treacherous liar, shifting from solid earth to sucking mud to deep black water in the space of a single step. Tangled roots, slick with algae, clawed at his ankles, threatening to drag him down. The air was thick with the smell of decay and vibrant life, of blooming night flowers and rotting vegetation. In the brief, startling flashes of lightning that illuminated the world in stark black and white, he saw a landscape of breathtaking and terrifying beauty, a maze of gnarled cypress knees, ghostly shrouds of Spanish moss, and the dark, unblinking eyes of things that watched him from the water's edge. He navigated by instinct, by the feel of the land, and by the two precious maps he held, one on paper, now soaked and fragile, the other etched in his memory. For 2 days he pushed on, fueled by the cured ham from Madame Genevieve, and a resolve that bordered on madness. He was hunted not by men with guns, but by a more relentless foe, the gnawing emptiness in his belly and the leaden weight of exhaustion in his limbs. On the third night, despair began to set in. He was lost, soaked, and shivering, with a deep chill that had nothing to do with the damp. He stumbled into a small clearing and sank to the ground, his head in his hands. The maps were useless in this impenetrable darkness. He had been a fool to think he could follow her. And then he saw it. It was faint. So faint, he thought his tired eyes were deceiving him. Through a gap in the thick canopy, a soft, greenish-white glow pulsed gently. It was not a star. It was too close, too personal. It was her light. A surge of adrenaline, potent as any whiskey, shot through him. He scrambled to his feet and crashed through the undergrowth towards it. His heart a wild drum of renewed hope. He found it tied to the high branch of a tupelo tree, just as Phoebe had described in their whispered conversations long ago. It was not magic. It was a small patch of cotton cloth, smeared with a thick, glowing paste of the phosphorescent fungus Mama Ilara had taught her to cultivate. It was a work of genius, a beacon visible only to someone desperately looking for it. Its light too faint to be noticed by a casual pursuer. He reached up and touched it, his fingers brushing against the damp cloth, and he laughed. A raw, choked sound of pure awe. This was Phoebe's science, her ingenuity, her unyielding will made manifest. The lights became his rosary, a glowing trail of breadcrumbs through the wilderness. He followed them for days, each one a small victory, a confirmation that he was on the right path. The journey was a crucible that burned away the last vestiges of the slave and forged a new man. He learned to read the subtle signs of the swamp, to find the clean water seeping from sandstone rocks, to identify the edible tubers of the arrowhead plant. He used the willow bark powder from Mama Ilara's pouch, mixing it with water to create a bitter tea that eased the feverish aches in his body. He was no longer just a field hand who followed orders. He was a survivor, a woodsman, a man reliant on nothing but his own strength and the knowledge passed down to him. He faced down a cottonmouth that blocked his path, his heart hammering as he waited for it to slide away. He slept in the high branches of a cypress, away from the things that slithered and crawled on the ground below. He was often terrified, constantly hungry and bone-weary. But for the first time in his life, he was the master of his own fate. And with every light he found, his admiration for Phoebe deepened into something akin to worship. She had not just escaped. She had built a road out of the darkness itself. He was near the end of his strength, his body wasted by hunger and his mind blurred with exhaustion. When he followed the last light, it led him to the edge of a wide, dark channel of water, and for a moment, his heart sank. It seemed an impassable barrier, but the light was on the other side, beckoning him. He waded in, the water shockingly cold, and swam, his tired muscles screaming in protest. He dragged himself onto the opposite bank, gasping and shivering, and stumbled into a thicket of palmettos. He pushed through them and then stopped, his body frozen in disbelief. He had stumbled into a clearing. Before him was a small, hidden island, a pocket of dry land in the heart of the bayou. A curl of smoke rose from a central fire pit, carrying the impossible, heavenly scent of roasting meat. There were crude but sturdy shelters built from woven branches and mud, and a small, meticulously tended garden where greens and corn were growing. It was a haven, a secret world carved out of the wilderness. Before he could fully process what he was seeing, a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall man holding a sharpened cane spear, its point aimed directly at Jeremiah's chest. Jeremiah, near collapse, could only raise his empty hands, his body trembling with a combination of cold, exhaustion, and a new sharp fear of having come so far, only to die here. The man with the spear said nothing, his eyes hard and suspicious. Then, a voice cut through the tension, a voice he knew better than his own heartbeat, yet one that was changed, imbued with a new resonance of command. "It's all right, Marcus. He's one of us." Phoebe emerged from the largest of the shelters, and the sight of her stole the breath from his lungs. She was transformed. The worn, faded cotton of a field hand's dress was gone, replaced by practical trousers and a tunic made from buckskin. Her hair was no longer hidden under a wrap but braided back, revealing the proud, strong lines of her face. She was leaner, harder, but her eyes burned with a fierce, brilliant light of leadership he had only glimpsed before. She was no longer a slave playing a dangerous game. She was a queen in her own hidden kingdom. They rushed to each other, but it was not the desperate, clinging embrace of lovers reunited. It was the powerful, solid clasp of comrades, of soldiers who had fought their way through a war and found each other on the shores of victory. He gripped her arms, his hands shaking, needing to confirm she was real, that this place was real. "Phoebe," he breathed, his voice a raw whisper of awe. "You really did it." A smile spread across her face, a true, free smile that reached her eyes and lit them from within, a smile he had never seen on the plantation. "No, Jeremiah," she said, her voice ringing with a strength that seemed to draw from the ancient trees around them. Asterisk. "We times did it, and we are just beginning." She squeezed his arm, her grip firm and reassuring. "Welcome to freedom's landing." Later, as he sat by the fire, a bowl of hot, savory turtle stew warming his hands and his soul, she explained everything. The scorched shawl had not just been a symbol of defiance. It had been a signal, a prearranged message to her first confederate, a runaway named Marcus from a neighboring plantation, that the plan was in motion. He was the man with the spear, her first citizen. The lights were their secret road, a network she was constantly expanding, a path for others to follow. The community was small, just 7 of them for now, men and women who had chosen the terrifying uncertainty of the swamp over the certain misery of bondage. They were building a new world here, a seed of a nation hidden in the heart of their enemy's country. Jeremiah looked from Phoebe's determined face to the faces of the others around the fire, their expressions a mixture of hope and hardship, and he knew he was home. The journey through the darkness was over. He had followed the light, and it had led him to the dawn. Disgraced, dismissed, and cast out from the only world where his cruelty had value, Dubois became a ghost of a different sort. Master Leblanc had fired him not with a roar of anger, but with the quiet, cutting contempt of a man discarding a broken tool. The harvest had faltered, the profits had dipped, and the obsession with a runaway slave had proven to be a poor investment. Now, Dubois was a lone hunter, haunting the edges of the swamp, a man with nothing left but a single, burning purpose. The fever he had contracted in the damp nights had taken root in his bones, leaving him gaunt and hollow-eyed, his skin slick with a perpetual sheen of sweat. He was armed with a long rifle and a fury that had been distilled to its purest, most toxic form. He had seen Jeremiah slip into the storm, had seen the tracks before the rain washed them away, and he knew the ghost had an accomplice. For weeks, he had been tracking him, living off the land with a grim competence, his once formidable skills as a tracker now sharpened by the razor edge of madness. He was no longer hunting a piece of property. He was hunting the source of his ruin. He moved with a predator's patience, circling the vast swamp, learning its rhythms, its secret paths, its patterns of life and death. He found signs, a footprint here, a broken branch there, faint traces that would mean nothing to another man, but to his hate-filled eyes, they were a map. He did not see the settlement itself. It was too well hidden, but he felt its presence. The air was different here, a subtle shift in the sounds of the swamp, the faint, almost imperceptible trace of wood smoke on the wind that was not from a lightning strike. He knew he was close. He found a dry hummock of land overlooking a narrow waterway, a place screened by a thick curtain of Spanish moss, and he lay in wait. He would not charge in. He would watch. He would learn, and then he would attack, dragging Phoebe back to Belle Reve in chains, to prove to the world, to LeBlanc, to himself, that he had been right all along. But Freedom's Landing had its own eyes. Marcus, while checking a line of fishing traps, saw the flicker of movement, the unnatural stillness of a shape that did not belong. He slipped back to the island, a silent shadow, and brought the news to Phoebe. A wave of fear, cold and sharp, rippled through the small community. They were found. The haven was breached, but as others looked to their meager weapons with panicked eyes, Phoebe grew unnervingly calm. The terror that had been a constant companion for her entire life was gone, burned away by the fires of leadership. She looked not at the fear on their faces, but towards the dark, waiting swamp. She thought of Dubois, of his hounds and his horsemen, of the way he used the open fields as a trap, a grid from which there was no escape. But this was not his world. This was hers. A slow, cold smile touched her lips. "He used the fields to trap us," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the rising panic. "He knew that land, and it gave him power." She turned to Jeremiah, her eyes locking with his. "Now he is in our land, and we will use the swamp to trap him." The plan was simple, elegant, and deadly. Phoebe and Jeremiah would be the bait. They slipped away from the island, circling around Dubois' position, their movements as silent and fluid as the dark water of the bayou. They knew this part of the swamp intimately, a treacherous, maze-like section of tangled mangrove roots and hidden channels that led to a place they called the soft earth. A known patch of quicksand masked by a thin layer of fallen leaves and deceptive green grass. They moved into position, and then Phoebe let out a sharp, clear call, the cry of a marsh hen, a sound that was both natural and, to a listening ear, deliberately placed. Dubois' head snapped up. He had heard it. They waited, and then Jeremiah called back, further to the left. The hunt was on. Dubois crashed through the undergrowth, his feverish strength giving him a reckless speed. He saw a flicker of movement, Jeremiah's back disappearing behind a thicket of cypress knees. "I see you," he roared, his voice a ragged bark of triumph. He plunged after them, his rifle held at the ready. Phoebe and Jeremiah led him on a chase, a deadly dance through the labyrinth. They used their knowledge of the terrain, appearing for a moment on a fallen log, then vanishing into the shadows, their voices calling out to him from different directions, taunting him, enraging him, pulling him deeper and deeper into the maze. His fury mounted with every step, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The calculated pursuit of a tracker devolved into the blind rage of a charging bull. He was no longer hunting. "I'll have you in chains, Phoebe," he screamed, his voice echoing eerily through the moss-draped trees. "You'll hang for this. I'll see you hang myself." From the high branches of a water oak, Phoebe's voice drifted down, calm and chillingly clear. "There are no chains here, Mr. Dubois," she called. "Only freedom. And the water." He spotted Jeremiah, seemingly cornered by a wide pool of black water, and let out a final triumphant roar. He lunged, his hands outstretched like claws, his face contorted into a mask of pure hatred. Jeremiah sidestepped with a dancer's grace, a move they had rehearsed a dozen times. Dubois, his forward momentum carrying him, took one more step, and the ground gave way. There was no dramatic plunge, only a soft, sucking sound. He was in it up to his knees, and a look of confusion, then dawning horror, spread across his face. He struggled, trying to pull his legs free, but his every movement only served to drag him deeper into the mire. The soft earth held him in its cold, inexorable embrace. "Help me!" he shrieked, the rage in his voice replaced by a raw, animal terror. He looked up and saw them, Phoebe and Jeremiah, standing on solid ground at the edge of the quicksand, watching him. They were not angry, not triumphant, just still. Their faces were unreadable, their silence more terrifying than any threat. "Help me, please," he begged, his voice cracking, tears of fear and desperation carving clean tracks through the grime on his face. I'll say you got away. I'll leave. I swear it." Phoebe and Jeremiah simply watched. They watched as the man who had haunted their lives, who had been the embodiment of their oppression, was swallowed by the very wilderness he had sought to conquer. They did not offer a hand. They did not say a word. They simply bore witness as the swamp, in its own slow, impartial way, delivered a cold, hard form of justice. The mire reached his chest, then his neck. His pleas turned to choked gurgles. His eyes, wide with a final, uncomprehending terror, remained fixed on them until the dark, greedy earth closed over his head. A few bubbles rose to the surface, and then there was only silence, broken by the gentle lapping of the water and the distant cry of a night bird. It was not a joyful victory, but it was a necessary one. It was the sound of a debt being paid in full. Years passed. The legend of the ghost of Belle Reve faded, replaced by more immediate concerns, by new overseers and changing fortunes. But the story did not die. It simply went underground, like the roots of the cypress trees. On the plantation, things changed and yet remained the same, a cycle of seasons and suffering. But in the heart of the swamp, a new world was being born. Freedom's Landing thrived. The small community of 7 had grown to more than 50, a bustling, self-sufficient town of runaways, rebels, and freeborn children who had never known the sting of a whip. They had built sturdy homes, a communal longhouse, and a forge. They established secret trade routes with sympathetic Cajun trappers and other hidden communities that dotted the vast, untamed wilderness of Louisiana. The path of lights, once a desperate trail for one, was now a well-traveled artery of the Underground Railroad, a glowing map that guided hundreds of souls out of the darkness of bondage and into the dawn of a new life. Phoebe was no longer just a survivor. She was a leader, a founder, a lawgiver. She and Jeremiah, their bond forged in fire and fear, now stood as the cornerstones of this new nation, their love for each other inseparable from their love for their people. One evening, back on the Belle Reve plantation, a new generation of children sat around a small fire in the quarters, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. Old man Cato, his hair now as white as cotton, and his body frail, but his eyes as bright as ever, was telling a story. It was a new version of the story, one that had been polished and perfected over the years. He told them of a cruel overseer, a man with a heart as black as swamp mud, who had chased a spirit into the bayou. He told them how the swamp itself, angry at the man's wickedness, had opened its mouth and swallowed him whole. He told them the spirit was a guardian, a woman made of moonlight and courage, who had built a road of stars to guide the lost and the brave. A small girl, her eyes wide with wonder, looked up at him. "Is the light still there, Uncle Cato?" she asked, her voice a hushed whisper. Cato smiled, a slow, deep smile that held the wisdom of a lifetime of sorrow and survival. He pointed a trembling finger towards the distant, dark line of the swamp. "Oh yes, child," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble. "On the darkest nights, if you look close, if your heart is true, you can still see it. Miss Phoebe's light." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that drew them all closer. "It's there to tell us that no matter how dark it gets, no matter how lost you feel, there's always a path. You just have to be brave enough to look for it." And as he spoke, far away in the deep, impenetrable blackness of the Louisiana night, a single, steady light glowed, a tiny, defiant star that was not in the sky, but of the earth, a beacon of hope, a promise, a legacy.